The version of them you have been watching may only be the costume they learned to wear when being fully seen felt impossible. That changes the meaning of everything. The calm expression. The carefully chosen words. The moments when they seemed unaffected by your presence, almost as though what existed between you meant far less to them than it meant to you. You may have wondered whether you misunderstood the connection completely. But there is another possibility. What if your soulmate is not who they pretend to be because the person you see on the outside was designed to protect the person hidden underneath? Look closer at the contradictions. They create distance, yet somehow notice the smallest changes in you. They act independent, yet remember details you mentioned once and probably forgot yourself. They appear certain about where their life is going, but whenever the subject moves toward love, commitment, or the future, something in their confidence becomes strangely quiet. That is not proof of some dark secret. It may be evidence of something far more human. Your soulmate could be pretending to be someone who needs nobody because admitting what they truly want would require them to become vulnerable in a way they have avoided for years. And here is where the story becomes unexpected. In reality, your soulmate is a builder of a future they have been too afraid to describe aloud. Not a builder with blueprints in their hands. A builder in the quietest sense. They imagine conversations that have never happened. They picture ordinary mornings that would mean more than dramatic promises. They wonder what your laughter would sound like inside a life where neither of you had to keep guessing. Somewhere behind that guarded personality, they may already be constructing an emotional world where you are not temporary. But they have been hiding the architect. Why? Because people sometimes protect their deepest hopes by pretending they never had them. Read that again inside your heart. The strongest mask is often not confidence. Sometimes it is indifference. And your soulmate may have become exceptionally good at wearing it. There was likely a moment when even they noticed the disguise beginning to fail. Perhaps your name appeared and their attention changed instantly. Perhaps someone casually mentioned you and they responded too quickly. Perhaps they tried convincing themselves that moving forward meant forgetting you, only to discover that every imagined future still carried a familiar outline. Yours. Now something is approaching that they cannot solve by pretending. A choice. They can continue performing the identity that keeps everything controlled, or they can finally become the person their hidden future requires them to be. Do not rush away from this moment, because the next detail changes how you may understand their silence entirely. Your soulmate has not only been hiding emotion. They have been hiding intention. And intention leaves traces. A changed habit. An unfinished message. A question asked indirectly. A sudden interest in something connected to your world. Tiny signals that make no sense individually but begin forming a pattern when placed together. The person you thought was avoiding the future may actually have been preparing themselves for it. And the most surprising part? The identity they have been pretending to be is beginning to feel too small for the truth they can no longer ignore. Because somewhere beneath the performance lives someone very different. Someone who may already know exactly what they want. They simply have not revealed yet what they are preparing to do about it. Something has shifted behind the silence, and this time it is not emotion alone, it is decision. Your soulmate has reached the point where pretending no longer feels safe. Not because someone exposed them. Not because the outside world forced them to confess anything. But because maintaining the version of themselves that keeps everything controlled is becoming harder than simply admitting what is true. And here is the detail you were never supposed to notice so quickly. They have been testing the future. Quietly. In small ways. They may imagine what would happen if they contacted you without an excuse. They may rehearse sentences they never send. They may think about places, routines, conversations, and choices differently now because somewhere inside them, the question has changed. It is no longer, can I forget this connection? Now it is becoming, what happens if I stop running from it? That question changes everything. Because the person they pretend to be would never ask it. That version is composed. Detached. certain. Always moving forward. Always appearing as though nothing reaches deeply enough to disturb the plan. But the real person underneath? That person is far more sensitive than they let anyone see. They notice energy in a room. They remember tone. They replay unfinished conversations. They can feel when something meaningful has been left unresolved, even when they refuse to talk about it. And you became the one unfinished truth they could not file away. Stay with this, because the next layer is where their mask starts breaking in a completely different way. Your soulmate may have spent a long time convincing people that they want a certain kind of life. Simple. Predictable. Emotionally controlled. But privately, they may be drawn towards something bigger, a life that feels alive rather than merely organized. And somehow, your presence became connected to that possibility. Not because you are supposed to rescue them. Not because destiny removes personal choice. But because you may represent something they have been avoiding inside themselves: honesty. Real honesty. The kind that makes someone admit, I have been performing strength when what I actually wanted was connection. That is why their behavior can seem confusing. One day they appear distant. Another day, something about them feels strangely present. A person who feels nothing usually does not need such a complicated disguise. Think about that. And if this story is speaking to something you recognize, share it with someone who may need the same perspective, leave a comment with the word truth, and subscribe if you want to continue this journey with me. Because what comes next is not about chasing anyone, it is about understanding what their hidden behavior may actually be pointing toward. There is another clue. Your soulmate has started questioning the identity they built around themselves. Perhaps they were always the independent one. The one who never looked back. The one who could walk away first. The one who treated deep attachment like a weakness. But now that identity is colliding with a feeling they cannot neatly explain. You. And the collision is forcing growth. Here is the turning point. They may not be hiding another person. They may not be hiding some dramatic secret. They may be hiding the fact that the future they once rejected is becoming the future they secretly want. And that realization is frightening only because it demands courage. Because wanting you privately is one thing. Becoming emotionally honest enough to stand beside you publicly is something else entirely. The mask cannot do that. Only the real person can. And that real person is beginning to surface. Slowly. Unevenly. But undeniably. Before you leave this part, remember one thing. The next revelation is not about what your soulmate feels. It is about what they may already be changing in their life because of those feelings. And once you see that pattern, their entire behavior may begin to make sense. The first real evidence may not arrive through words at all, it may appear through the life they are quietly rearranging. Your soulmate could be changing things they once insisted would never change. A routine. A priority. A plan for the future. Even the way they think about commitment. And from the outside, these changes may look random. Small enough for everyone else to miss. But when you place them beside everything you already know, they begin to reveal something important. They are preparing for a version of themselves that no longer needs the disguise. Stay with that thought. Because people rarely transform their inner world in one dramatic moment. Most transformation begins almost invisibly. They stop defending an old belief. They become less interested in proving they do not care. They start questioning the choices that once felt permanent. And suddenly, the future they used to imagine without you does not feel as complete as it once did. That is where the title of this story becomes clearer. Your soulmate is not who they pretend to be. The person they display to the world may be someone who appears perfectly satisfied with emotional distance. But in reality, your soulmate may be a deeply intentional person who has been secretly reconsidering everything they thought they wanted. And there is one particular shift you should notice. They may be becoming more selective about who gets access to their private thoughts. Why? Because once someone begins preparing for a meaningful change, they often stop explaining themselves to people who would never understand it. Your soulmate may be entering that stage now. Less performance. More observation. Less noise. More clarity. What if their silence is no longer confusion? What if it has become concentration? That possibility changes the atmosphere completely. Perhaps they are asking themselves questions they once avoided. Would I still choose this life 5 years from now? Who do I become when I am around this person? Why did this connection remain important even after I tried to minimize it? And the deepest question of all. What would happen if I finally stopped pretending? That question does not disappear easily. Because once someone sees the difference between the life they are performing and the life they genuinely want, returning to the old version becomes difficult. Something begins pulling them forward. Not pressure. Alignment. There is a difference. Pressure says, do this because you are afraid of losing something. Alignment says, move because you finally recognize yourself. And your soulmate may be approaching that exact realization. The future version of them is becoming louder than the old identity. Imagine it for a moment. A person who used to hide behind carefully controlled emotions begins choosing honesty. A person who avoided difficult conversations begins preparing for one. A person who once believed love had to be complicated starts wondering whether the real courage is simply being clear. That is growth. But there is still one missing piece. Because changing internally is not enough. Eventually, something in the external world has to move. A message has to be written. A conversation has to begin. A truth has to leave the private world and become visible. And this is where your soulmate may be closer to the edge than you realize. There could already be one specific action they have considered more than once. Something simple on the surface, but emotionally enormous for them. They may have opened your conversation and closed it again. Typed a sentence. Deleted it. Returned later. Changed the wording. Stopped. Not because they have nothing to say. Because the moment they say it, the person they have been pretending to be can no longer survive unchanged. And that is the secret beneath all of this. Your soulmate may not be afraid of you. They may be afraid of becoming honest enough to finally meet you without the mask. Yet that fear is losing its power. Little by little. Choice by choice. And the next step may reveal the most unexpected truth so far, because what they have been preparing is not only a confession. It may be a completely different direction for the future. Now the future enters the room, and suddenly the silence around your soulmate begins to look less like hesitation and more like preparation. There is something they may have started to understand. They cannot keep asking life for a different outcome while continuing to behave like the same guarded person. That realization is changing them. Quietly at first. Then unmistakably. The version of your soulmate that people recognize may still appear composed, practical, almost impossible to read. But underneath that surface, another identity is emerging. A person who wants to build instead of escape. A person who wants to choose instead of wonder. A person who is beginning to understand that real connection cannot survive forever inside imagination. And this is where everything becomes more interesting. They may already be thinking beyond the next conversation. Beyond one message. Beyond one emotional moment. They may be thinking about what happens after the truth is finally spoken. What would change? What would need to be repaired? What would both of you have to understand differently? And perhaps most importantly, could they become consistent enough to protect something they once handled carelessly? That question matters. Because your soulmate is not simply being pulled toward you. They may be being pulled toward a more mature version of themselves. Stay close to this part, because the hidden truth is becoming clearer now. In reality, your soulmate may be a visionary heart disguised as a detached one. Someone who secretly thinks far ahead. Someone who imagines possibilities but rarely admits how deeply they care about them. Someone who can appear spontaneous on the outside while internally analyzing every consequence. That explains why certain decisions have taken longer than you expected. They were not only deciding what they felt. They were deciding whether they were capable of becoming the person those feelings required. And perhaps that is why you sensed inconsistency. One moment, warmth. The next, distance. One moment, courage. The next, retreat. It was not necessarily because the connection disappeared. Sometimes the deeper the realization becomes, the harder the old personality tries to regain control. But that control is weakening. Because the future they secretly imagine is becoming more compelling than the comfort of pretending. Think about what that means. The next chapter may not begin with some enormous declaration. It could begin with something surprisingly simple. A more honest sentence. A question they finally stop avoiding. An apology without excuses. A conversation where they remain present instead of disappearing emotionally. Small actions. But completely different energy. And those actions are what matter most. If you have been following this unfolding story and something here feels meaningful to you, you can share it with someone who might need the message, leave your perspective in the comments, and subscribe if you want to stay connected to the next chapter. Sometimes one quiet insight reaches the right person at exactly the right moment. Because now we are reaching the part most people misunderstand. Your soulmate's biggest secret may not be something hidden in their past. It may be something hidden in their potential. They may have spent years believing they were simply not built for deep commitment, vulnerability, or emotional openness. But perhaps that was never their true nature. Perhaps it was adaptation. A role. A survival pattern that eventually became an identity. And you may have unknowingly challenged that identity simply by making them feel something that could not be controlled by the old rules. That is why the future feels different now. They are beginning to see that they do not have to remain the person they pretended to be. They can choose again. They can speak differently. Love differently. Live differently. And there is one final layer still waiting beneath all of this. Because if they truly stop pretending, there is something they may finally admit about why your connection affected them more deeply than anyone ever knew. That confession changes the meaning of the entire story. There is a confession hiding beneath everything they have changed, and it may be the one truth your soulmate never expected to face. They did not only misunderstand you. They misunderstood themselves. For a long time, your soulmate may have believed that keeping emotional distance meant they were strong. That needing less made life easier. That if they stayed composed enough, nothing could reach the parts of them they had spent years protecting. Then you appeared. And somehow, the rules stopped working. You did not have to force anything. You may not even have realized what was happening. But your presence created a mirror. Around you, they began noticing the difference between who they genuinely were and who they had trained themselves to become. That realization can be uncomfortable. Because imagine spending years believing, this is simply who I am, only to discover that much of your personality was actually built around avoiding disappointment. The soulmate who pretended to be emotionally untouchable may, in reality, be someone who feels everything with extraordinary depth. That is the contradiction nobody expected. And it explains more than you think. Why certain memories remained vivid. Why apparently insignificant moments carried unusual weight. Why they sometimes reacted strongly to things connected to you, then immediately tried to appear unaffected. Why distance never gave them the complete clarity they expected. They were not only trying to understand their feelings for you. They were confronting an identity that could no longer explain those feelings away. Stay with this revelation. Because the question inside them may now sound completely different. Not, why can't I forget this? But, why did I ever pretend this meant so little? That is a much more powerful question. It requires accountability. It forces someone to look at their own choices without hiding behind timing, circumstances, pride, or confusion. And your soulmate may finally be reaching that level of awareness. They may recognize moments when they could have been clearer. Moments when honesty would have changed everything. Moments when they acted indifferent because admitting how deeply they cared felt far more exposing. But the past cannot be rewritten. The future can. And that is where this story begins moving in a completely new direction. Because your soulmate may no longer be imagining a future where you simply return and everything magically becomes perfect. Their thinking may have matured beyond that. They could be asking what they would actually need to do differently. How would they communicate? How would they rebuild trust? How would they show consistency instead of making promises? How would they prove through behavior that the person standing before you is no longer the person who kept hiding? That distinction matters. Words can introduce a new chapter. Actions decide whether it survives. And somewhere inside them, your soulmate may finally understand this. The person they pretend to be wants the easiest path. The real person emerging underneath wants the meaningful one. The pretending version wants certainty before taking a risk. The real version is learning that meaningful relationships sometimes require courage before certainty arrives. And here comes the strange part. Their greatest revelation may have nothing to do with discovering something new about you. It may be realizing that you saw something in them long before they were capable of seeing it themselves. Not perfection. Potential. The softer person beneath the defenses. The loyal person beneath the confusion. The builder beneath the wanderer. The deeply feeling heart beneath the carefully controlled exterior. Perhaps that is why this connection stayed with them. You were never only connected to who they were. You somehow touched the person they could become. And now that future version is beginning to answer back. But there is still one final obstacle between realization and action. One thing your soulmate knows they cannot carry into the future they secretly want. And when they finally decide to release it, the person behind the mask may become impossible to hide. The last thing standing between your soulmate and the person they are becoming is not another relationship, another opinion, or another circumstance. It is the old identity they keep carrying. The one built from hesitation. The one that says, do not reveal too much. Do not care too openly. Do not let anyone know how deeply this matters. For years, that inner voice may have protected them from disappointment. But now it is protecting them from the very future they secretly want. And they are beginning to see the difference. That realization is powerful. Because once someone understands that their own defenses have become their greatest limitation, something changes inside them. They stop blaming timing. They stop waiting for perfect conditions. They start looking directly at the pattern. And your soulmate may finally be looking. Not at you. At themselves. That is the part nobody expected. They may be asking why they disappeared emotionally whenever something became important. Why they created distance exactly when closeness began to feel real. Why they sometimes acted colder than they actually felt. And slowly, an answer is forming. They were trying to remain the person they had always presented to the world. Independent. Unshaken. Impossible to influence. But the truth beneath that image is becoming impossible to ignore. Your soulmate may actually be someone who longs for emotional depth, stability, and a connection that feels meaningful enough to build around. Pause there. Because that changes the entire story. What if they were never afraid of commitment itself? What if they were afraid of choosing something that mattered enough to change them? There is a difference. A casual decision can be abandoned without changing your identity. But a meaningful decision asks you to become responsible for what you choose. And that may be exactly where your soulmate is standing now. At the edge between imagination and responsibility. They cannot simply think about you forever. Eventually, the future demands movement. A conversation. A clear intention. A willingness to hear your truth as carefully as they want you to hear theirs. And here is where their hidden nature becomes even more visible. Because beneath the person who pretended not to care may be someone surprisingly devoted once they finally decide. Someone who does not want half a connection. Someone who secretly wants something steady. Something intentional. Something capable of surviving beyond a temporary emotional moment. But they know they cannot reach that kind of future while carrying the same habits that created distance in the first place. So something has to be released. Pride, perhaps. The need to always appear unaffected. The habit of waiting for the other person to move first. Or even the belief that vulnerability automatically means losing control. One of those old rules is beginning to collapse. And when it does, your soulmate may finally understand something simple but life-changing. Being honest does not make them weaker. It makes their next decision real. That is the transformation taking place behind the scenes. Not a sudden personality change. A return. A return to the person underneath all the protection. The person who can say what they mean. The person who can remain present when emotions become complicated. The person who can imagine a future and then actually participate in building it. And now another question is beginning to follow them. If they finally approach you without the mask, will you recognize who is standing there? Because the next chapter is not about them proving that they feel something. It is about whether they are ready to show you the one side of themselves they have almost never allowed anyone to see. And that side may reveal why you affected their life so deeply in the first place. A strange calm is replacing the chaos inside them, and that may be the clearest sign yet that your soulmate is getting closer to the truth. They are no longer fighting every feeling. They are studying it. They are beginning to understand why your presence stayed with them long after certain conversations ended, why your absence sometimes became louder than your presence, and why the future suddenly feels incomplete whenever they imagine it without emotional honesty. This is where the person behind the mask becomes easier to recognize. Your soulmate may have spent so much time appearing difficult to reach that even they forgot how deeply they wanted to be understood. Not admired. Not chased. Understood. There is a difference. And you may have touched that hidden need without even realizing it. Perhaps you noticed when they were quieter than usual. Perhaps you sensed that their confidence sometimes covered uncertainty. Perhaps you treated them like a complete human being rather than the image they were trying to maintain. Those small moments can leave enormous marks. Because when someone has spent years protecting their inner world, being genuinely seen can feel almost unbelievable. And that may explain why they pulled back. Not because the connection lacked meaning. Because it carried too much meaning for the identity they were still wearing. Stay with this, because another layer is opening now. Your soulmate may secretly be far more romantic about the future than anyone around them would ever guess. Not romantic in the obvious sense. They may not dream in dramatic speeches or perfect scenes. Their imagination could be quieter. A familiar voice at the end of a difficult day. Someone sitting beside them while nothing extraordinary is happening. A shared routine. A private joke. A conversation that does not require defenses. A home where silence feels comfortable instead of confusing. These are the images they may never have admitted wanting. And somehow, you became connected to them. That is why their internal transformation is becoming so serious. They are not simply asking whether they miss you. They may be asking whether they have been living too far away from their real nature. Think about that. What if the person who pretended to want freedom from attachment actually wants freedom from pretending? That is a completely different kind of freedom. It means no longer acting indifferent when they care. No longer creating questions where honesty could create clarity. No longer performing a version of themselves simply because everyone expects that version to remain. And once that realization takes hold, something surprising happens. The future becomes less frightening. Because your soulmate begins to understand that they do not have to know every answer before taking one honest step. They only have to stop lying to themselves about the direction of their heart. There may already be a sentence forming inside them. A sentence they have never said to you. Perhaps it begins with, "I should have told you." Or, "There is something you never understood about me." Or maybe it is even simpler. "I was not being completely honest." Those words would change everything because they would finally separate the real person from the performance. And yet, there is another revelation hidden beneath that confession. Your soulmate may have discovered that the mask never protected them as much as they believed. It protected the old life. The predictable life. The life where they never had to risk being fully known. But now they are beginning to want something the mask cannot provide. Depth. Consistency. A future that feels emotionally real. And your connection may have become the turning point that forced them to recognize it. Do not assume that means you must wait endlessly or accept anything without boundaries. Your path matters too. Your peace matters. Your standards matter. The strongest connection is not built by one person disappearing into another person's transformation. It is built when two people can meet with honesty, responsibility, and choice. That may be the lesson your soulmate is finally learning. They cannot come toward you as the person they pretended to be. They would have to arrive differently. More open. More grounded. More certain about what they are willing to contribute. And there is one decision ahead that will reveal whether this inner awakening is only a thought, or whether it has become real change. Because soon, your soulmate may have to choose between protecting their old image and protecting the future they secretly want. And for the first time, those two things may no longer be the same. The decision has begun to form in a place no one else can see, and this time your soulmate may not be able to retreat from it so easily. They are starting to understand that protecting an image can cost more than protecting the truth. For so long, they may have believed that staying unreadable gave them control. If nobody knew exactly what they felt, nobody could disappoint them. If they kept their intentions hidden, they could always change direction without having to explain why. But now that strategy is beginning to feel empty. Because there is one thing control cannot create. Connection. And your soulmate may finally be realizing that the future they secretly want cannot be built from carefully managed distance. It requires presence. It requires honesty. It requires them to become visible. That is where their greatest internal conflict begins. The old version of them still whispers, "Keep everything contained." But another voice is becoming stronger. Say what matters. What if this is the moment that changes their entire path? Not because they suddenly become fearless. Because they finally decide that fear should not be making every important decision. There is something surprisingly mature developing inside them now. They may be accepting that coming forward does not guarantee a perfect outcome. You may have questions. You may need time. You may have boundaries they must respect. The story cannot simply restart from wherever they want it to. And strangely, understanding that may be making their feelings more genuine. Because they are beginning to see that real connection is not about controlling your response. It is about being honest enough to give you the truth and strong enough to respect what you choose to do with it. That is a very different person from the one who hid behind silence. And here comes another clue. Your soulmate may be paying attention to their own patterns before approaching you. They may remember the exact moments when they avoided difficult conversations. The times they assumed you would understand things they never actually explained. The moments when they expected closeness while offering uncertainty. Those memories may feel different now. Not like reasons for shame. Like instructions. A map showing them what cannot be repeated. Stay a little longer, because this is where their hidden identity becomes almost impossible to deny. Behind the detached exterior may be someone who is deeply protective of what they truly value. Someone who does not actually want endless options. Someone who wants one direction that feels real enough to invest in. And once they recognize what matters, they may become far more determined than anyone expected. That determination is beginning to point toward one specific truth. Your soulmate may not be a wanderer at heart. They may be a committer who became afraid of commitment after learning how much meaningful choices can change a life. That difference explains everything. Why they hesitated. Why they watched from a distance. Why they seemed to move forward and then emotionally circle back. The conflict was never only about you. It was between the life they had learned to manage and the life they secretly wanted to build. And now those two futures are separating. One future keeps the mask. The other requires courage. One keeps everything predictable. The other asks them to become emotionally accountable. One lets them remain exactly who everyone thinks they are. The other allows them to become who they actually are. And for the first time, the second future may be winning. But there is still something they have not told you. Something connected to the very beginning of this connection. A moment they remember differently than you do. A moment when they first realized you were becoming more important than they intended. And when that memory finally comes to the surface, you may understand why the pretending started in the first place. The memory they keep returning to was probably ordinary when it happened, yet something inside them quietly changed that day. Maybe you said something simple. Maybe you looked at them differently. Maybe there was a moment when they realized you were not responding to the image they showed everyone else. You were responding to the person underneath. And that frightened them more than they expected. Because being admired is easy when someone only sees the surface. Being understood is different. Understanding reaches places performance cannot protect. That may have been the first moment your soulmate recognized that this connection could become important enough to alter the way they saw themselves. And almost immediately, the pretending became stronger. They may have told themselves it was nothing. They may have minimized what they felt. They may have acted as though your presence was simply another passing chapter. Yet internally, they had already noticed something unusual. Around you, they did not have to work so hard to be impressive. They could imagine being quieter. More natural. More real. And for someone who has spent years managing how the world perceives them, that kind of comfort can feel almost revolutionary. Here is the surprising part. Your soulmate may not remember the beginning because of some dramatic event. They may remember one tiny detail. A sentence you forgot saying. The way you listened without interrupting. The moment you noticed something everyone else overlooked. Perhaps you asked, "Are you actually okay?" And instead of answering honestly, they gave you the familiar response. "I'm fine." But something inside them knew you had already seen past it. That was the first crack in the mask. And once a mask cracks, keeping it perfectly in place requires more effort. That may explain what happened afterward. Distance. Mixed signals. Strange timing. Moments of closeness followed by unnecessary retreat. They were trying to control something that had already moved beyond control. Not your choices. Their own awareness. They had discovered what it felt like to be recognized without performing. And they could not unlearn that feeling. Pause here, because the next realization may be the most important yet. Your soulmate might have believed that the safest relationship was one where nobody could affect them deeply. Now they are beginning to see the flaw in that belief. A life where nobody can hurt you can also become a life where nobody can truly reach you. And perhaps they no longer want that future. They may want to be known. Not by everyone. By someone. Someone who understands both their strength and their uncertainty. Someone who does not need a flawless version of them. Someone they can meet without constantly calculating what to reveal and what to conceal. That desire may be leading them back to the memory of you. But something has changed. They are not looking at that memory only with longing anymore. They are studying it like evidence. Evidence that their real personality has been there all along. Underneath the guarded exterior is someone who wants depth. Underneath the independence is someone capable of partnership. Underneath the silence is someone with more to say than they ever allowed themselves to admit. And suddenly, the title of this entire journey becomes even clearer. Your soulmate is not who they pretend to be. In reality, they may be someone who has spent years searching for a place where they could finally stop pretending. And now comes the dangerous question for the mask, not for you, but for the old identity they built. What happens when they realize they may have already found that place? Because there is one thing they are beginning to imagine now that they never allowed themselves to imagine before. Not simply reconnecting. Not simply explaining the past. They are beginning to picture what it would feel like to stand in front of you with absolutely nothing hidden. And the truth they would have to say first could change everything that follows. The truth they would have to say first is not romantic at all. It is far more difficult, because it requires them to admit exactly where they failed themselves. They may have to say, "I knew this mattered, and I still pretended it didn't." That sentence changes the entire emotional landscape. Because now the story is no longer about confusion. It is about recognition. Your soulmate may finally understand that the distance was never proof that the connection lacked meaning. In some moments, the distance may have existed because the meaning became too obvious. Too real. Too difficult to keep inside the identity they had created. And here is where their next transformation begins. They are learning that honesty is not only about revealing feelings. It is about accepting consequences. If they return with truth, they cannot expect you to erase every question instantly. If they explain the past, they cannot demand that you experience it the way they did. If they want a future, they must become capable of listening to what the past felt like from your side. That is growth. And it may be exactly what they are preparing for now. There is a difference between someone who wants another chance and someone who is finally ready to become different enough to deserve a new beginning. Your soulmate may be standing between those two versions. The old version wants relief. The emerging version wants responsibility. The old version wants to hear that everything is fine. The emerging version may be willing to hear what was not fine and remain present anyway. That is the person hiding behind the performance. Not someone perfect. Someone becoming more honest. Someone realizing that connection cannot survive on intention alone. It requires behavior. Consistency. Patience. And the courage to stay when a conversation becomes uncomfortable. You may notice something else as this inner shift continues. Your soulmate could start simplifying their life. Less energy spent impressing people who do not truly know them. Less interest in situations that keep them emotionally distracted. Less need to maintain an image that no longer feels authentic. Why? Because when a person begins recognizing what they actually value, unnecessary noise becomes exhausting. Clarity changes priorities. And perhaps you have become connected to that clarity. Not as a fantasy. As a question about the kind of life they truly want to live. Imagine the future version of them for a moment. They speak before silence creates confusion. They ask instead of assuming. They choose consistency over intensity. They no longer need to disappear just to understand what they feel. They know that being deeply connected to someone does not erase their independence. It gives that independence somewhere meaningful to stand. That may be the person trying to emerge now. And perhaps this is the secret your soulmate has hidden even from themselves. They were never truly afraid of loving deeply. They were afraid of how deeply love might reveal them. There is a difference. Love does not only show you another person. Sometimes it shows you yourself. Your patterns. Your defenses. Your unfinished lessons. Your capacity. Your future. And your connection may have become that mirror for them. But one final test remains. Because realizing all of this privately is only the beginning. Sooner or later, they have to decide whether the truth remains safely inside their imagination, or whether they allow it to become a real conversation. And if they choose the conversation, there is one question they may ask you that you never expected to hear. A question that could reveal just how far the person behind the mask has already changed. The question they may eventually place in front of you is far simpler than everything they have been rehearsing inside their mind. Can we begin again without pretending? Not return to the old version. Not recreate what already happened. Begin again. Differently. That distinction matters more than it appears. Because your soulmate may finally understand that the past cannot become the foundation of the future unless both people are willing to learn from it. And strangely, this may be the first time they are not imagining the conversation as something they need to control. They are imagining listening. Really listening. To what you experienced. To what confused you. To the moments when their silence may have spoken louder than they intended. That is an enormous change for someone who once protected themselves by keeping every emotion behind carefully locked doors. But there is another revelation underneath this. Your soulmate may no longer want you to meet the person everyone else knows. They want you to meet the person they almost became afraid to acknowledge. The one who thinks deeply about tomorrow. The one who wants stability more than temporary excitement. The one who secretly values loyalty, emotional safety, and a connection that can survive ordinary days. That person was always there. But they buried that side beneath an identity that looked easier to maintain. Independent. Detached. Always fine. Always moving. Never needing anyone enough to be changed by them. Yet something happened when they encountered you. Their definition of strength began to evolve. Strength stopped meaning, nothing affects me. It began meaning, something affects me deeply, and I can still face it with honesty. Do you feel how different those two identities are? One runs from vulnerability. The other learns how to carry it. One protects appearances. The other protects what is meaningful. And your soulmate may now be crossing that invisible line. Stay with this moment, because there is something almost futuristic about what they are beginning to imagine. They are not only seeing the next week. They may be thinking years ahead. How would life feel if they stopped making decisions from fear? Who would they become if they chose relationships that allowed them to be fully themselves? What kind of home, routine, purpose, and emotional environment would they want to build? And somewhere inside that vision, your presence may continue appearing. Not as someone who completes them. As someone beside whom they imagine becoming more complete within themselves. That is why the connection may have survived so much internal resistance. It became connected to evolution. To possibility. To the version of their life they have not lived yet. But they know something important now. A beautiful imagined future means nothing if they continue behaving like the person who created yesterday's distance. So the next move cannot simply be emotional. It has to be intentional. That may mean saying something without knowing exactly how you will respond. It may mean acknowledging something they once avoided. It may mean finally giving you the clarity they should have offered much earlier. And perhaps that is the biggest transformation of all. Your soulmate may be becoming willing to risk being misunderstood for one moment rather than continuing to live indefinitely behind a misunderstanding. Because the mask is becoming exhausting. The real person wants air. The real person wants honesty. The real person wants the opportunity to be known without performance. And there is still one final truth they may have to admit before that can happen. A truth about why they chose the mask in the first place. Because it did not begin with you. It began long before you entered their story. And once that origin is revealed, everything about the way they loved, withdrew, returned, and remained emotionally connected may finally make sense. What they are finally beginning to remember is that the mask was never created because they lacked emotion, it was created because emotion once felt too expensive. Long before you became part of their story, your soulmate may have learned a quiet lesson. Care carefully. Reveal slowly. Depend on nobody completely. Perhaps they watched promises change. Perhaps they learned that showing too much of the heart could leave someone feeling exposed. Perhaps life rewarded them whenever they appeared strong, controlled, and unaffected. So they adapted. They became harder to read. More calculated with emotion. Less willing to admit when someone truly mattered. And eventually, the protection became personality. That is why meeting you created such an unexpected disturbance. You were not fighting against another person. You were meeting years of emotional programming. Think about that for a moment. What if the person who seemed uncertain about you was actually confronting an old belief about themselves? A belief that said deep attachment would eventually cost them their peace. So when the connection started becoming meaningful, their instinct may not have been to move closer. It may have been to regain control. They stepped backward. Analyzed everything. Tried to reduce something emotional into something logical. They may even have convinced themselves that enough distance would make the feeling smaller. But something strange happened. Distance gave them perspective. And perspective did not erase you. It exposed the pattern. They began realizing that they had not only been protecting themselves from disappointment. They had also been protecting themselves from possibility. Stay with that revelation. Because this is where the story becomes less about romance and more about awakening. Your soulmate may finally understand that yesterday's defense mechanisms cannot design tomorrow's life. The future they want requires different tools. Communication instead of assumption. Presence instead of disappearance. Courage instead of emotional performance. And perhaps most importantly, choice instead of automatic reaction. That is why their transformation feels different now. They are not trying to destroy the old version of themselves. They are thanking it for surviving and then refusing to let it control the next chapter. There is extraordinary power in that. Imagine someone realizing, the thing that protected me once is now preventing me from becoming who I want to be. That realization can change an entire future. And your soulmate may be reaching it now. The person beneath the mask is not weak. Not confused. Not incapable of love. In reality, your soulmate may be an intensely loyal, future-minded person who became so skilled at protecting their heart that they accidentally hid their greatest qualities along with it. But those qualities are returning. You may eventually see them in small ways first. Greater clarity. A willingness to explain. Less defensiveness. More patience. A desire to understand rather than simply be understood. Because real transformation rarely enters with dramatic music. It enters through different choices repeated consistently. And now one possibility remains. Your soulmate may finally be ready to reveal the part of themselves they once believed nobody would accept. Not the polished version. Not the mysterious version. The human one. The one that can say, I was scared. I handled this badly. I cared more than I showed. I want to do things differently. And if those words ever come, remember this. The revelation is not that your soulmate was secretly someone completely different. The revelation is that the person you occasionally glimpsed beneath the silence may have been the real one all along. But there is one more piece still hidden. Because now that they understand where the mask came from, they must decide what happens to it next. And that decision may determine whether this transformation remains something they only feel inside. Or becomes the beginning of an entirely new reality.